Welcome. Today we're going to go over Plantation, Hawaii, Ronald Takaki's chapter on that. And so let me share my screen. There it goes. All righty. Let me move myself to the left a little bit. All right. So today we're going to go over Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki, Chapter 4, The World of Plantation, Hawaii. So Hawaii is actually made up of many islands. It is a huge place with many different cultures and many different languages. So Plantation Hawaii, again, Ronald Takaki is actually from Hawaii, and you see that, it was a huge place to develop sugarcane. And chapter 4 talks about the world of Asian America moving to Hawaii. So you see it was like a lot of harsh areas with barracks where people lived in a very close proximity and they were pitted to work against each other. Lots of Japanese women were also immigrated here, and this is of course very different from other ethnic groups because they were not allowed any women. So this is something very interesting. So I would like you to put that in your notes. That's very interesting that there are women allowed. So let's look at the timeline. In 1850, the Masters and Servants Act, and let me just take myself out of here. It legalized the apprenticeship, indentured service, and the contract labor system. In 1851, the Chinese were imported. 1852, the Portuguese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, Spaniards, Russians, and Norwegians were also imported. And 1900s, Hawaii becomes a state. So a lot of Filipinos were sugar workers in Hawaii alongside the other ethnic Asians. And sugar is king. Now, how does sugar affect ethnic diversification? Now, you can pause it now and answer these questions and come back in 10 minutes. All right, you can definitely find it in the book as well. Well, it's very fascinating how they pitted different ethnic Asian groups against each other. So they originally brought in different ethnic groups like the Japanese, and when the Japanese didn't want to be mistreated anymore, they brought in other groups such as the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Koreans, the Portuguese, who were sometimes broke their strikes. So again, very, very contentious ways that Asians were pitted against each other. Now, 1853, Hawaiians represent 97% of all the people in Hawaii, but 70 years later, which is really astounding, I think it's even less now, Hawaiians represent only 16.3. And again, I want to ask you why and how did this happen? And we will talk later about this concept of settler colonialism, right? This is actually a tragic and sad thing, like what happened to all these native Hawaiians who were here. Well, first of all, I want you to know that the sugarcane was a lot of harsh labor. They're treated no better, quote, than cows and horses. And these were people. These were people primarily from Asia, but they're treated like cows and horses. Well, and something I want you to put down in your notes is they were counted by their numbers, not by their name. And again, back to humanization makes me think of other times in history where people are called by their number, and that's never a good thing. Now, 7% of the workers were women, and women were paid 55 cents a day, and men were paid 78 cents a day. So you see, women were also mistreated in this system. So you saw a lot of Chinese and Japanese workers. And again, I put a female picture because Japanese women were allowed, okay? And that's so different from the West Coast. But I don't want you to think that Asians did not fight back. They resisted. They fought back. They knew they're being mistreated, and they striked, and they did a lot of things, right? And this goes against this idea that Asians are passive and they don't fight back. In 1920, on Oahu, a sugar strike, the Japanese and Filipino workers went on strike together for 6 months on 4 major Hawaiian islands. And concurrently, guys, the Filipinos were also going on strike later in the west coast of California with the Chicanos. So kind of cool. The workers totally fought back against their overseers. Their riots, their murders, their protests. Michel Foucault Foucault says, where there's power, there's resistance. So definitely lots of collective labor actions that these different Asian groups did, and it was wonderful. More resistance. You know, some of the workers would say they're feigning sickness. They said they're like, oh, I'm feeling sick, I can't work. And this is similar to how African Americans actually resisted during the slavery times as well. They kind of said they're sick, etc., and they were do lots of different things, like maybe breaking the button or something to resist, right? Also, there's lots of resistance in trying to like not doing work. So instead, you know, because they were being overworked like animals. They had drugs, they had wine, they had gambling, they ate. Sometimes they flee their contracts before they were over. And after their contract, they never came back, right? They would like make an excuse to leave and they never came back. So why did the workers resist? So you can pause right now and answer that question, okay? Obviously, it's because they're humans and, you know, they wanted to, their selfhood, right? And so workers always resist when there's inequality and injustice. And again, what reflected the social hierarchy of the camp? You can actually pause right now. So unfortunately, unpause, you can see that the social hierarchy of the camps was based on ethnic group and gender, right? And also race, right? With Portuguese making more than Japanese, Japanese making more than Chinese, Chinese making more than Filipinos, Filipinos making more than the next group that came along. So again, massively segregated, and again, pitted against each other. So they always try to divide and conquer, divide and conquer. So lots of strikes. In 1909, Japanese organized the Waipahu plantation strike because of the differential wage treatment based on ethnic groups. So of course, they talked to each other and they found out they're all doing breaking labor, but they're all being treated and paid differently. For instance, the Portuguese earned around $22.50 for the same work that the Japanese did for $18, right? And of course, the Chinese made less, the Philippines made left. And again, and what they did is when they protested, they would bring in a new ethnic group to kind of break the strikes. So after the Japanese protested, then after the Portuguese protested, they brought in the Japanese. And after the Japanese protested, they brought in the Koreans and Hawaiians, the Filipinos and Chinese to break the strikes. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So here is a great picture of the 1946 Great Hawaiian Sugarcane Strike. So here showing visually that they did strike back and resist. Eventually, they all got better conditions. And today, many Asian American descendants are doing much better than actually Native Hawaiians who have decreased academic outcome and who are overrepresented in the prison and system. So again, I want you to think about why is this the case, and I want you to look up this concept of settler colonialism. Okay, so I want you to discuss this at home. Settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that seeks to replace the original population of colonized territory with a new society of settlers, right? So one argument you could say with the Spanish settling in like Latin America or Mexico or the British coming to the United States, you take over the land and you like replace the natives, right? And so one argument for Hawaii is it's a settler colonized state, which is very controversial because that means these early Asian immigrants in Hawaii, did they enact settler colonialism? Well, now they've kind of replaced, when we talked about earlier, right? It used to be 97% Native Hawaiian, but now it's 16%, and now I think it's even much less, right? So these Asians have really populated the whole islands and done relatively well, right? And so it's just a form of settler colonialism. And again, this is very controversial within Asian American studies, but it has to be called out. They were definitely part of the stream to take over these islands, right? And eventually they benefited. So wonderful. I'm going to stop my sharing. I hope this is something food for thought, thinking about Hawaii and how I really encourage you guys to visit and how it's still going on, this like racial, ethnic, and gender diversification. And I will see you next class. Great.